Hey there, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW-LP Brattleboro. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. Unfortunately, regular contributor Emily Kornheiser had some legislative priorities she had to attend to this week. So thankfully, John Walters from the Vermont Political Observer is here today to bail me out so you don't just have to listen to me talking to myself for for 45 minutes to an hour. Welcome, John.
Thank you for having me.
So, yeah, you and I really haven't had a chance to talk too much since November 6th. I feel a lot of folks, are very happy with this election and how it turned out both nationwide and statewide. And then there are those who are not. I have not spent a lot of time watching the national news since November 6th. And every now and then I'll get an alert on my phone and it's like reality crashing down around my head all over again. I'm wondering for you, what did this election say, or did it signal anything? Kind of what are you sitting with right now?
Well, do you mean nationally or in Vermont or both or
Let's start with national because I think some of what happened nationally, okay, I'll back up. So often Vermont feels like its own little universe and its own little island, and we are that very special place. And yet it felt like there were ripple effects happening on the national stage that rippled into Vermont in this election in ways that it didn't feel, at least to me, previous elections have done. So that's kind of where the question was coming from.
yeah, well, I mean, actually, in both national and Vermont, I'm a liberal, and I have been my whole life, and so it was unexpected and disappointing and disheartening.
Mm.
I am old enough that I have been repeatedly disappointed by national results, starting with Richard Nixon in 1968. Um,
Oh dear.
it's it's kind of like slow devolution, and Trump is the last stage of this, where particularly, especially given his performance in the last couple of months of the campaign, where it seemed pretty obvious that he was kind of losing it um, for a plurality of Americans to decide that he's what they wanted in their leader was, kind of shocking to me. And I wake up at night worrying about what's going to happen on a whole range of issues, from climate
Mhm.
change to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, international relations, Ukraine, Gaza. Um, you know, every time Trump picks a new cabinet nominee, and it seems like he's just opened the door on the clown car again. Um, it just doesn't seem real, and I fear it's going to take us a long time to come out of this if we ever do,
Mhm.
or maybe we are just slipping further and further into sort of an oligarchical form of government where the rich people just rule and the rest of us take what we can get, and we all fend for ourselves rather than trying to build a society that is more just and equitable and inclusive and cares for all its people. Um, so I have been, frankly, avoiding national news coverage as much as I can. And I thank my lucky stars that my beat is Vermont politics, because here in Vermont, as you said, a lot of these same ripples, these same effects were seen in our results. But what that means nationally is we're probably going to, be in for a lurch to the right and to the weird
Hmm.
and to the, kleptocratic. Um, in Vermont, what it means is we're probably lurching to the middle.
That's a good point. Yes.
So, one of the big unknowns is how does the new federal government affect Vermont? And I'm probably getting way into your list of questions here, but um, on two levels. One is to the extent that Trump and the Congress are able to hack away at various federal programs that Vermont depends on, from the environment to education to social services and healthcare.
And we should say that as a small state and, you know, where we fall wealth wise around the rest of the country, I'm not sure, but we rely on the federal government a lot for
Yeah,
waivers, for funding, etc. Yeah.
yeah. Uh, to natural disasters, is Trump going to feel inclined to expedite FEMA money to the state who is governed by the only Republican who openly disdains Donald Trump and voted for the Democrat in each of the last two elections?
Hmm.
It seems highly likely that we will be in last place when it comes to disaster funding. And Vermont has had a remarkable run of federally declared disasters in recent years. As much
Yeah.
as we think we are immune to the effects of climate change, in many ways we are uniquely vulnerable, particularly in how our waterways can't handle large amounts of precipitation, at once.
And we have very big mountains that funnel a lot of water into those waterways. Yeah.
Yes, and where are our cities and towns? They're in the valleys along
Hmm.
those waterways. So there, we could be in much, like just for instance, there's a lot of talk about the Vermont healthcare system being in serious trouble right now. What's that going to be like if the ACA goes away and a lot of people go without insurance coverage and
Right.
all of that? It could make our healthcare crisis substantially worse. So, you know, it's challenging times, I think, and maybe things will not be as bad as we think, but I would not underestimate Donald Trump's capacity for
Revenge.
revenge and maladministration. He's clearly, by the choices he's putting in charge of his government. We have yet to see who's in charge of FEMA, but if it's another Dr. Oz or RFK Jr. or Pete Hegseth, or, well, I guess it's not Matt Gaetz anymore because he just withdrew. Uh,
Hmm.
but I don't doubt that Trump would like to politicize federal disaster relief as thoroughly as he wants to politicize everything else.
Yeah.
So we could be in for a very rough time during a Donald Trump administration.
No, I'm curious your thoughts. Um, we were talking earlier, and I've mentioned this in Whitingham that we tend to be a little more purple than the rest of Windham County, and this election cycle compared to the one before, uh, I saw a handful of Trump signs in 2016, and then this time around, a lot of my neighbors had Trump flags or Trump signs. Some have gone up since the election, so I don't know what that meant. But maybe they're like, well, maybe just in case we better put this up.
Oh, I think some people who are conservative or pro-Trump in Vermont feel like they're, in a sea of blue, and
Yeah,
maybe they're feeling a little freer to declare themselves after the election. I don't know.
I suspect you're right. So I've seen that just on the local level in my immediate, non-scientific area here. But also going into the election on the state level, we had some big issues. We're dealing with a housing crisis.
Mhm.
We're worried about incomes, we're worried about taxes, we're worried about school spending. And you and I had talked before the election about, what might that mean
Yeah.
for the state election levels. Um, the shift to the middle that you talked about, how much do you think that is people responding to the at the national level, And how much do you feel maybe voters, when they were picking their state senators and their House reps, were responding to state issues?
I think there's room for both.
Okay.
And I should, disclaimer here, I was wrong about the election, just as wrong as every other liberal in the state of Vermont was. Uh, we have lived through election cycle after election cycle where Phil Scott has slammed the legislature, run against the legislature, insisted. I've been seeing, Republicans running on restore balance in Montpelier since 2012, at least.
Hmm.
And it doesn't happen. People have voted over and over again for heavy Democratic majorities in the legislature. And so I thought, there's no reason to think this won't happen again. And this time it didn't. It went the other way in a big way.
Hmm.
Democrats do still have majorities. As I've talked to a couple of old heads recently, what we have done is we have returned to kind of the standard majorities that the Democrats had under Jim Douglas and even under Peter Shumlin. Um, you know, they still, they're still in the upper 80s in the House and 17 out of 30 in the Senate. That's not nothing.
Hmm.
It's a lot less than they had. Um,
Well, and with the exception of Zuckerman, most
right.
other department heads like Secretary of State and Attorney General,
That's
Treasurer, they all stayed Democrat as well, or
They
progressive.
did, but what I noticed in the returns when I wrote something about Zuckerman's loss, and one of the things I noticed is that each of the Democratic statewide candidates, leaving aside the governorship,
Hmm.
you know, lieutenant governor, auditor, secretary of state, attorney general, treasurer, um, each of them lost about 10% support, 10
Oh,
points.
yes. Right.
Um, the problem for Zuckerman is that they went from 65% to 55%. He went from 54% to 44%. So, there's there obviously was a fairly broad abandonment by many voters of the Democratic brand,
Hmm.
and I think I think it's a lot needs to be thought about and discussed and explored to determine why this happened. And I would assume that the Democratic Party is embarking on an effort to understand what happened and to respond to it, whether that's to change their policies or find a different way of communicating their policies to the public. The legislature in the last few years thought that it had an agenda that was positive for Vermont and would result in a better Vermont for more people. And they got slapped down by the voters.
Hmm.
So either they have to adjust their agenda or they have to find a new message or messenger. Um, particularly in rural Vermont.
Yeah.
Now, I think there are two big things maybe were at play here, just from my limited understanding of what's gone on. Uh, I
In the
think
topsy-turvy world we live in, is that what you're saying?
I think property taxes was a big one.
Yeah.
That was bigger than the Democrats realized. I think probably the only person who did realize it was Phil Scott. He also
Hmm.
was the only person in Vermont who did substantial polling, spent a lot of
Mm-hmm.
money on polling, not only for him, but also for the lieutenant governor's race and some of those Senate races the Republicans flipped. So he had to see that there was a wave coming. And he rode the wave. Good for him. Um, so I think a lot of that was property taxes. A lot of people really got hammered by property tax increases, and the government didn't do anything about it, or didn't do enough about it. Um, the other thing I think the Democrats lost a lot of the ground they lost was in rural Vermont. They still got Chittenden County, they still got Washington County, they still got most of Windsor County and Windham County and
Yeah.
Bennington County. Um, but they lost the kingdom pretty much. They are shut out completely of Franklin County, which used to be sort of like moderate Democratic territory. They're pretty much shut out of Rutland County. So, and what I think we have seen to some extent nationally that also played out in Vermont is that um, outside of major population areas, the country got redder. You know, the Trump support, as you said in your town,
Yeah.
more people openly supporting Donald Trump and openly and going in that direction. And there seems to be sort of a purification going on where, you know, and Chittenden County can still be blue, but if you go, you know, 20 miles outside, then you're in solid red territory and you see a lot of Trump signs. So I think that's the other big thing was whatever was going on nationally that turned the election in a way that Democrats did not expect also went on in Vermont,
Hmm.
partly to do with state issues, but you know, national issues tend to be stronger polls in elections than state issues
Hmm.
because most people pay a lot more attention to national politics than to state politics. So, you know, there's going to have to be a postmortem and a coming a reckoning, and we shall see how that plays out in party politics and also in how the legislature responds to the results of the election. We're
Yeah.
starting to see little signs of that, but we shall see how it plays out between now and you know when the legislature reconvenes in the new year.
Hmm. Speaking on the point of rural Vermont, I'm currently working on an article for Vermont Business Magazine where I spoke to a number of folks in the Northeast Kingdom. And it came up quite often this sense of the rest of the state not understanding what rural Vermont needs. And I think it's feeling probably very heightened right now because of I call it the Oliver Wyman report about hospitals. And
Mhm.
North Country Hospital is one of the hospitals in the Northeast Kingdom that it was recommended that they either reduce their services or change the type of hospital they are. And um, one healthcare person who works in healthcare said to me, you know, who we need more people in our towns. And who's going to move to a town that you have to drive 45 minutes an hour to get your primary care doctor?
Yeah,
You know, who's going to move children to an area where you have to travel that long? Um, and he said, you know, it feels very much like an equity issue that if we start shrinking our healthcare services in rural areas, what we're basically doing is we're creating, you know, those who have reliable cars and can take time off work and have the money to travel, or the support network of someone who can take them, they will continue to get care.
yeah,
Those who don't have cars or can't take time off work will not. And so it will create like this to have or have not
yeah,
group. And I think I share that story because I think for a lot of people, at least the folks I spoke to for this article, that's what they feel like, that they're having to make these either or choices in a state that isn't even open to discussing what factors they might be dealing with.
yeah. Well, I would say to those people, if you feel neglected now, just wait until Donald Trump's agenda takes hold. He does not give a damn about rural America. Um,
No.
and you know, if he again, like we said a few minutes ago, if you know, if he does what he says he wants to do to the healthcare system, those rural hospitals are going to be in a whole lot more trouble than they are now.
Yeah.
Um, and so, you know, if they felt that way and voted for Trump, they're going to be completely disappointed. Um, but anyway, they have grounds for feeling, you know, neglected. If the Democrats' agenda in the legislature was aimed at producing better results for Vermonters, um, it hasn't happened fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
And in the meantime, the consequences of things like, you know, school funding and healthcare and housing and all of that are, you know, are being felt.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think I would say on the subject of whether there's enough people living in a community to support a hospital, then these communities had better change their attitude toward building more housing.
Hmm.
There was
That
just
is a very good point.
there was just a story recently about a housing development in Putney that had been held up for years because of the opposition of two people who live there. Um, it just got
Yeah.
cleared by the Supreme Court, but it took years. And I have seen stories like that all over the place, not just in small towns, in Burlington and Montpelier and other places where, new housing is generally resisted by people who the existing inhabitants. And what they don't realize is that we need more housing if our communities are going to uh, thrive or even survive.
Hmm.
Montpelier, I live just outside Montpelier, and Montpelier is suffering from sort of one of the after effects of the COVID pandemic, which is that there are a lot fewer people working downtown than there used to be.
Oh, right. Yes.
A lot of people, like a lot of offices, not state offices, and also state related offices.
Hmm.
The Vermont League of Cities and Towns had before COVID, had a staff in the office every day of like 50 to 60 people. And about 80% of those people either don't work there anymore or work out of their homes, don't necessarily go into the office, and they have sublet part of their office space. Um, a lot of state offices are a lot emptier than they used to be.
Hmm.
And one of the ripple effect of that is that there is less foot traffic in downtown Montpelier, and
Yeah.
retailers and restaurant owners and et cetera are feeling a real pinch. And so, what Montpelier needs to do, they can't just cross their fingers and hope the offices come back. They are going to need to make a serious push on housing. And I think a lot of people in the community, some people in the community would resist that because they're afraid of changing the character of the town.
Hmm.
I understand that. People love Montpelier who live around here, but it faces a real challenge to adjust to new realities and to make itself. You know, would be a great place to live for someone without a car.
Yeah. Actually, it's a
There's
very walkable downtown.
It's a walkable downtown with a supermarket, a hardware store, a bookstore, a stationery store, a kitchen supply store, post office. It's got everything within walking distance, unlike many towns and cities. So it would be a great place, and I think that Brattleboro is having serious problems. I think there is room for a housing push in a lot of communities, large and small, in Vermont. And I think that some people are going to need to set aside their fears of the unknown or of change and,
Hmm.
accommodate more people and give Vermont a chance to, you know, survive and become a better place for more of us.
Hmm. It, this has been on my mind, and we have a few minutes before we have to hear from some underwriters. But, I've been thinking a lot about comparing the western side of the state with the eastern side of the state, in the sense that on the eastern side of the state, you have New Hampshire, which does not have a sales tax and does not have an income tax. And in Vermont, our wages tend to lag behind New Hampshire for starters, not exclusively, but our minimum wage is higher than New Hampshire's, but a lot of our other wages may not be. And
Kind
so,
of implicit Vermont tax. A lot of employers pay less here than they do elsewhere, and
right.
the assumption is they can get away with it because a lot of people want to live in Vermont and might be willing to take less of an income. Uh,
Hmm.
and that is largely true, but there is a limit to that.
Right. Which is what the point I was going to make is we really need to make sure our communities are vibrant.
Yes.
So when someone's looking at the difference, at least on the east side of the state, between no income tax, but maybe a community that's really wonderful and juicy and vibrant, they would choose Vermont. So yes, another reason we need good housing, enough of it, and affordable with a lowercase a. Um, any last minute thoughts before we hear from underwriters, John?
Um, well, I mean, wrapping this up in a bow, I guess, we are entering very uncertain and very challenging times here in Vermont. And it's not just the state issues, and there are tons of them. Um, it's the reverberations from what's about to happen at the federal level on what we can do here and what we'll
Mm-hmm.
have money to do here. Just as one example, I talked to one person who's involved in one of the communication union districts, the broadband
Right.
rollout, and he said that, there is a fear that the federal money for broadband is pretty either going to dry up under Trump or is going to be funneled to for-profit entities rather than CUDs. And that, the CUDs may be in a position, may be in a more precarious financial position. That's just one small, uh, it's big, but it's
It's
small
big.
compared to all the other issues we face. So it's Vermont still has a lot going for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a hellhole. I mean, I'd rather be here than Mississippi, for instance, but we do face some big problems, and we do face a lot of big uncertainties.
Yeah.
And It's going to be challenging times, and it is incumbent on our leaders, and maybe we'll discuss this more in the second half. It is incumbent on our leaders to find ways to work together
Mm-hmm.
and find paths forward that we can agree on. And that's not going to be easy across a whole spectrum of issues.
Yeah.
So stay tuned for more happy news in the second half of the program.
Yes. Usually we say this is the Montpelier Happy Hour where, everything shakes out. We might be having to change our tagline to the Montpelier Happy Hour when democracy drives you to drink. I'm not sure which it might be. Anyway, you have been listening to WVEW Brattleboro. We will be right back after we hear from some underwriters. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW Brattleboro. So glad you can join us today. And if you are just joining us, I am Olga Peters, your host and producer, and I'm speaking with journalist John Walters, who is the force behind the Vermont Political Observer. He is also a photographer of bunny rabbits because he is the proud pet parent of two. And I suspect in the 4 years ahead, many of us will need to look at cute photos of bunny rabbits.
Yeah.
They might save us all. Um,
I've started posting some of them. I've started actively using Blue Sky as opposed to Twitter, and I've
mhm.
started posting occasional bunny pictures on Blue Sky, and people do seem to appreciate it. So
Yeah, just a moment of breathing,
yes,
quiet, sweet bunnies. Um, John, one of the things I've been thinking about going back to that kind of question around what does it mean for Vermont with what's happening in the federal government versus what's happening on the state level. And I think there's a narrative in the US about the states being the great places where experiments can happen when it comes to policy and regulation. But we also have a system of government where the federal government gets the final say,
mhm.
and it's in the Constitution that it gets the final say. And so I'm wondering, what do you think that means for Vermont if our lawmakers decide to take the state in different directions or with different policy? How much I don't know. I'm just curious. Like, do we actually have the power to kind of push back against things we're seeing at the federal level?
Yeah. Uh, I mean, a lot of that is going to depend on what exactly the federal government under Donald Trump is going to do.
Mm,
Under the previous Donald Trump and under his Supreme Court, we have seen conservative states enabled to do things that were far more conservative than what federal government generally was doing. Are we going to see the same leeway afforded to blue states,
Mm-hmm.
Vermont and Illinois and New York and California and Massachusetts? Or is the Trump administration and or Congress and or the Supreme Court going to step in uh, step in on policies that they don't like in a way that they didn't step in to prevent policies that they agreed with in red
Mm-hmm.
state? What if the Supreme Court, you know, overturns marriage equality?
Yeah.
What if, I mean, we have abortion rights in our Constitution, reproductive rights, but what if the federal government, forbids the interstate sale of the morning after pill or even of contraception?
Mm-hmm.
There's a hoary old law, Hoary, hoary old law on the books called the Comstock Act, which
Mm.
used to be used to bar the interstate sale of contraceptives of any kind
Yeah.
or pornography. I don't know that even conservatives really want to return to the Comstock days, but maybe they do, or maybe they would like to, step on the rights of states that would take a more progressive path.
Yeah.
What's going to happen with immigration and immigration enforcement? What if the feds are serious? What if Donald Trump is serious about deporting anyone who isn't here legally, which would be somewhere between like 11 and 17 or 18 million people, including a lot of people who work on our farms and in our
Mm-hmm.
food systems? Then if the feds want to sort of disengage the federal government from a lot of what it has done in the past, that's one thing. Like, what does it mean for education generally if Trump disbands the Department of Education? I
Right.
don't know what that means, but it means something. It will probably have tremendous consequences.
Yeah.
Uh, so it depends on if they sort of disengage the federal government from stuff, that's one thing, and that's serious enough. But if they are going to intervene, if they're going to send out the military to combat protests, if they're going to send out the military or the National Guard or higher scores more, immigration agents, and they're going to like start visiting farms and, asking everyone for their papers and dragging off anyone who doesn't have them, then our country will be a much different place in a few years than it is now,
Yeah.
uh, and in many ways that are very bad, I think, in my opinion.
So I think
Time
uh,
for a bunny picture now.
I think it might be time for a bunny picture. Yeah. As we're talking about the end of days and the apocalypse,
Yes.
uh, let's bring out the bunny pictures. Well, you were mentioning you had tuned in to one of Governor Scott's recent press conferences where he had sort of said, okay, folks, let's cool our heels. Let's not push back too far too fast, which I find interesting. Um,
He did say it in the context of like he does not like Donald Trump.
mhm,
He voted against Donald Trump,
right.
and he put it in the context of like I'm hoping that the people who come into office with him have a broader view of things,
Hmm.
which is another way of saying I think Donald Trump is a nut, but I'm hoping that he'll be reined in by the cooler heads around him, like by the people on Wall Street, for instance, who would be hurt by a massive tariff imposition.
Hmm.
So the governor is saying, let's not panic. Let's not, overreact to something that hasn't happened yet.
Which is actually probably good advice. Or as one of my editors at the Commons likes to say, let's not borrow trouble.
Um, uh, on the other hand, I can see the wisdom in at least sort of talking about what might happen and trying to plan for it,
Yeah.
because Trump and his minions are certainly planning for what they want to do. But I can see. I thought that the governor's remarks were fairly measured and tempered, and even a little bit brave. I mean, to
Mm-hmm.
restate some of his criticisms of Donald Trump, when we know that Donald Trump has a very broad capacity for vengeance.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you know, Phil Scott. It's probably too late. Phil Scott is already in his crosshairs, but saying anything that might further offend Trump and his people is, could have real consequences for Vermont. So,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, we're going to be at the mercy of some very large forces, and we'll have to see where they take us and try to respond to what happens.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Governor Scott will also be working with the new legislature. As you mentioned before, the Democrats no longer have their supermajority. Um, and we have spoken on this show many times about our frustration with Scott. It seems like he doesn't really put forward a policy or put forward a concrete policy or a concrete agenda. And then when things don't go his way, he comes back and says the legislature didn't work with me and I have to veto this,
Hmm.
is sort of broad strokes. Um, do you think that will continue, or do you think the loss of the supermajority may actually force him to come to the table before policy is built?
Well, I would never underestimate his capacity for not coming to the table. Uh, I think he has made far less use of far broader political power than just about any politician I can think of. He has been more a sort of a shepherd, a manager of state government than
Mm-hmm.
an active leader of state government, in my view. There are a number of serious issues in Vermont on which we have largely drifted since he became governor. And to some extent, even before he became governor, the last 2 years of Peter Shumlin were pretty meh. Um, but the way Vermont's government has always worked, you know, we talk about, like, the three co-equal branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial.
Mm-hmm.
But in actual fact, the executive has by far more resources and more people and more money
Yeah.
than the other two branches. The legislature has very little in the way of support staff, and its members are part-time. So what normally is supposed to happen is that the governor and his administration, almost always his, one her so far, um, the governor and his administration get together and look at what's happening and prepare a legislative agenda and present it in January at the State of the State address and the budget address.
Yeah.
And then the legislature basically takes what the governor proposes and works from that basis. And what's happened in recent years is that the governor has, except for sort of broad strokes, we need to do something about this and something about this, without proposing specific policies or specific legislation, leaving it to the legislature. And he could say with basis that it wouldn't do him any good to propose, big ideas and specific legislation when he's facing a supermajority on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
I get that, but without the supermajority, he ought to return to the traditional way and the way it's always worked, of the governor proposing a thorough agenda addressing our problems, and then turning it over to the legislature and working with the legislature on enacting something between what he proposes and what they would like,
Hmm.
that's acceptable to all. That's how our government has always worked. It hasn't the last few years, and you can blame the governor, you can blame the supermajority, um, but it needs to go back to its normal basis. Whether the governor is up for that, I do not know. Um, uh, he needs to, because we are drifting on a whole lot of big issues:
Yes.
the healthcare system, the education system, workforce, housing, opiates. The more I think about this, climate change and resiliency, um, uh, you know, uh, transition to a greener future, which he has resisted any specifics on. Um, we need to make progress on these, whether it is, and it can't just be his vision, and it can't be just the Democrats' vision. It needs to be some kind of common vision.
Hmm.
That's going to be a challenge for all parties.
Yeah.
But it has to, in my opinion, it has to start with the governor coming in January with a serious agenda that the legislature can work from as a basis for what it does.
Hmm. Do you feel there's been some change in leadership in the Senate and the House, um, around, majority leaders and with seats that have flipped? Do you think that how do you think that will impact or not, the governor and the legislature working together?
Well, the Senate Democratic Caucus had its meeting last weekend and chose a new majority leader. Um, and the old majority leader was Allison Clarkson from Windsor County. The new
Hmm.
one is Keisha Himsdale from Chittenden County. Um, and it's an interesting choice because a lot of what drove the election, particularly like the Democrats lost most of their ground in the outside of the Chittenden, if you want to call it the freeway corridor, from Chittenden to Washington County to Windsor County and down to Windham County.
Hmm.
That's the core of Democratic strength now. That's like
That's 91 and 89
91 and 89.
for listeners outside of Vermont.
But if you look at like the 17 Senate seats that the Democrats now hold,
Hmm.
that is, I'm trying to add quickly up, if you add Chittenden, Washington, Windsor, and Windham, that is 14 of the 17
Okay.
Democratic seats. The other three are two in Bennington and one in Addison.
Okay, the Route 7 corridor.
Yeah, so um, and that is not really a corridor. That is a corridor, completely roadblocked in Rutland County.
Hmm.
Um, so you could call that a corridor, or you could call it islands. Um, but that's the split in the state right now. And one of the things the Democrats will have to do is to find ways to reconnect with the rest of the state, or they will have to be happy with, more or less the majorities they've got now, or they are about to
Hmm.
have in the new session.
Right.
Uh, and to add more Chittenden County to its leadership seems like a step in the other direction.
Hmm. Hmm.
They might argue, well, we don't really have a lot of choices because we lost a lot of our, representation from other parts of the state. The two senators from Bennington are going to be rookies in the new term.
Hmm.
So if they were going to choose anyone for leadership, it would have to be like Ruth Hardy from Addison County, or it would have to be from, the freeway corridor.
Hmm.
Um, but I have heard rumblings that there's going to be some changes in House leadership because of the election results. A couple of House leaders lost their elections,
Right.
and I have heard rumblings that the new leadership people will be drawn largely from Chittenden County. And again, that's kind of understandable because that's where a lot of their people are from, a lot of their senior people are from.
Yeah.
But it seems like a step in the wrong direction if you want to reach out to the rest of Vermont.
Yes. Yeah, I think the legislature's in an interesting spot, especially the Senate, because I don't know the exact numbers, but you remember a few years ago we had that real big turnover in lawmakers, both in the Senate and the House. And this turnover is not as big, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly, but it's still a lot of institutional knowledge,
Yeah,
and a lot of just relationships that
yeah.
have been built over time. And so there'll be a number of people getting their feet under them for the first time in this new session.
The Senate is going to be very interesting because it is a body that lives on tradition and seniority.
Mm-hmm.
But in the last three election cycles, they have lost a ton of seniority. And, I wrote a piece back in the spring just based on the number of retirements on the Democratic side, um, and, departures. We've had a couple of deaths, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Um, but, a lot of what the last biennium had a lot fewer senior senators than the preceding couple of bienniums. And we're going to have a lot fewer in the new biennium. And, the results of the election took out a couple more senior senators,
Mm-hmm.
Mark McDonald and Chris Bray.
Yeah.
Um, so there's going to be a lot of new people, a lot of people who are for the first time or been there for 2 years or 4 years. Four is going to be like a senior tenure level. You're going to have committee chairs and vice chairs who have served one term in the Senate, and that's
Mm-hmm.
unheard of. So they're really facing a big change. And in the House, the Democrats lost two of their caucus leaders and two chairs of big committees.
Yeah.
Diane Lanford, chair of appropriations, lost her bid for reelection. And Mike McCarthy, who was chair of government ops, lost in St. Albans. He was the
Mm-hmm.
last Democrat standing in Franklin County, and now he is no longer standing. So there's going to be a lot of change. The Speaker and the Senate President pro tem will stay the same, Joe
Mm-hmm.
Kowinski and Phil Baruth, but uh, they are going to face big new challenges in terms of managing their caucuses and managing the chambers as a whole and managing a very new and different relationship with the governor.
Mm-hmm.
So they got a lot of work to do, and maybe that's why Emily Kornheiser isn't with us this week.
Yes, she's a little bit busy. Yeah.
I was
Well,
hoping to ask her what she thought of all this, and I'm not sure whether she'd tell us the truth. But anyway, yes, I understand why she's not here because
mhm,
things are happening in a hurry, and we're talking about hitting the ground running in less than 2 months now, like
mhm,
about 6 weeks, with holidays between now and then.
yeah.
So it's going to be coming at us real fast.
I have no doubt Emily would tell us the truth. It's just so much is in flux. I don't know what she could tell us
Yeah.
beyond what she's sitting with. You know, to a certain extent, okay, I'm going to need a bunny picture again because I'm going to get really cynical here. You know, John, you and I work in a profession where sometimes it doesn't really matter how good a job we do,
Mhm.
someone's perception of us. It matters whether we wrote what they wanted to hear.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's what it comes down to. And for me, sometimes that's frustrating, and then sometimes it's really freeing, to just know that it will have nothing to do with what I wrote. It was, what this person wanted to hear. But I have a slight soft spot for lawmakers because, yay, bunnies! For our
Sure.
radio listeners, I'm getting a look at two bunnies who are snuggling on the carpet.
Well,
They,
they're both lop-eared rabbits, and they really, really like each other, and they spend a lot of time sort of snuggling next to each other. So,
Especially, I can imagine with the cold weather coming.
yes,
Aw, thank you, John.
coats of fur. But anyway, follow my Blue Sky account to see more bunny pictures and thoughts on Vermont politics.
Yeah, and if you're listening on WVEW or listening on our podcast, go over to our YouTube station and you can see the bunnies. But I have a soft spot for lawmakers because um, even though they work a quote unquote part-time job, in many cases it's not, especially if you hold a place of responsibility like you chair a committee. And so there needs to be something, there has to be a reason you're doing this beyond the paycheck and beyond making life easy on yourself. And I feel that in recent years, whether we agreed with the policies or not, the a lot of the sitting Dems did try to put forward new policies.
Hmm.
And like you said earlier in the show, policies they felt um, were better for Vermont. And so I can't imagine it doesn't feel personal when you're not reelected. Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
to feel that you put out all this work, time, and effort, and lost wages for many people,
Yep.
um, to
Well,
not be appreciated.
if you're a young person who's serving in the legislature, you are sacrificing sort of the career building stage of your adult life.
Mm-hmm.
The time when you might be advancing to a senior position and earning more money and set and establishing a family and saving for college and all that stuff. And you're working for $9,000 a year in a job that demands far more of your time than that and puts you in the spotlight and makes you a target in many cases for the ire of constituents. And it is a thankless job. And I am grateful that there are people on both sides who
Mm-hmm.
are willing to do it,
Yes,
which doesn't keep me from criticizing them when I think they deserve it. Anyway, part of the
definitely.
problem here, I guess.
Yeah, part of the cycle of life. So we have a few minutes before the end of the show, John. We've covered a lot of territory. As we go forward, in your writing, you've paid a lot of attention to housing. You've paid a lot of attention to healthcare and Governor Scott and how he's been maneuvering through Montpelier. I'm curious, going forward, what will you be watching? What are your issues du jour, maybe is the way to put it.
Well, I mean, the I'm going to be looking to see what the governor does in January. Does he propose a serious agenda that the
Mm-hmm.
legislature can sink its teeth into? I think the legislature is chastened enough by the election that they will be willing to meet the governor halfway.
Mm-hmm.
You saw the comments at the Senate Democratic caucus last weekend suggest that they know they need to change course and they know they need to accommodate the views of Vermonters who feel like they are being priced out of Vermont,
Yeah.
especially on like property taxes. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I think there is a willingness to create a new relationship, but it's going to need to become reality in a real hurry because legislative sessions go by real fast. There are big, complex, serious issues in play that no matter what they propose, the solutions are going to be unpopular in some quarters.
Mm-hmm.
If they propose housing, like for instance, enabling more housing by limiting the ability of individual local residents to block housing, or even
Mm-hmm.
of like local government to block housing, which we might need to do. What happens if we start closing or cutting back on hospitals and schools? Um, and we got to find ways to make this state work better in on a lot of issues. And one thing that Vermonters are not good at is accommodating change.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not just a that's not just a conservative thing. There are plenty of liberal Vermonters who don't want Vermont to change in the slightest.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's going to be big and interesting times. Consequential, certainly. Uncomfortable, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I guess there will always be plenty of fodder for the Montpelier Happy Hour and for my blog.
Yes, in a way, it is job security for
Yep.
us.
In our well-paying jobs.
Yes. the things we're doing as passion projects, you mean?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, John. And I should say, I forgot to say at the top of the this half that the views and opinions of everyone on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guest. Nobody else, not the platform, not the radio station, not even the cute bunnies snuggling in the photographs, and giving us that moment of calm. John, if people want to read your blog, where can they go?
Well, it's called the Vermont Political Observer, and the web address is just thevpo.org. If you can't remember that, search for, John Walters and the VPO, or just search for the VPO and you'll get me and the Vienna Philharmonic. I'll leave it to you to tell the difference between the two.
One has bunny pictures, one does not.
Yes, one has bunny pictures, one has Strauss waltzes.
And of course, the Montpelier Happy Hour thanks to BCTV, who takes the video version of this show and shares it with media centers around the state. You can find us on many of those stations late at night. If, the worries of the political world are keeping you up at 2 a.m., you can probably find us on TV somewhere, or wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. And of course, every Friday at 2 p.m. here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. Take care, everyone, and stay safe.